Boa noite a todos e a todas. Mais uma vez, a gente vai começar mais uma noite, a segunda noite, última noite do CIRIPE, nosso Congresso Internacional de Relações Internacionais de Pernambuco. Estamos ao vivo no YouTube da Faculdade Damas e eu tenho uma honra de apresentar dois amigos que vão palestrar para nós, né? A primeira, a professora Jane Rooney, da Universidade de Durham, na Inglaterra, e depois que a professora falar, o professor Alex Magalhães, da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, ambos experts na área de Direitos Humanos, Fronteiras e Relações Internacionais, que é o tema da nossa primeira mesa, né? E em seguida dessa mesa aqui, eu já aproveito, né, o momento para convidá-los para a nossa segunda mesa de Religião e Relações Internacionais, que começa às 8h30. Então, eu vou agora mudar o idioma, né, mas antes de apresentar a professora e depois passar a palavra para ela, quero passar a palavra para o nosso coordenador, professor Elton Gomes.
Muito boa noite, caríssimos. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos para esse segundo dia do nosso CIRIPE, o Congresso de Relações Internacionais de Pernambuco. Hoje teremos discussões no campo dos direitos humanos e da religião em associação com os fenômenos políticos e socioantropológicos das relações internacionais. Espero que todos vocês possam aproveitar a noite de hoje do ponto de vista do debate intelectual que será aqui desenvolvido. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Jenny Rooney for being here tonight in order to speak to our audience. And so I hand the floor to Pedro in order that he can introduce our speakers.
Okay, let's go now. First of all, I thank you very much, Dr. Jane Rooney, for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much for that. And I would like to introduce Dr. Jane Rooney. Dr. Jane Rooney joined Durham Law School as assistant professor in international law in September 2020. His as well is PhD at Durham Law School. Jane researches the intersections between international human rights and public law in extraterritorial abjudication. Jane was a lecturer in law at Bristol University. So I would like to give the floor to Jane. And please, Jane, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And please welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Suarez and Professor Gomez, for inviting me here this evening. I'm really delighted to be presenting as part of this fantastic series for the International Congress on International Relations. I'm now going to share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see it in a moment's time. So hopefully you can see the first slide of my presentation. This evening, I will be presenting on the rise of multinational...
Okay, it's on screen.
Pardon?
Okay, it's already on screen.
Lovely, thank you very much. So I will present this evening on the rise of multinational corporate accountability for transnational human rights violations. The extractive industry is defined as the people, companies, and activities involved in removing oil, metals, coal, stone, and other precious resources from the ground. The extractive industry has both positive and negative implications for local communities across the world. On the one hand, it can create jobs, contribute to local infrastructure, and ensure access to basic elements which form the building blocks of everyday necessities in contemporary life. On the other hand, the practices of extractive industries can be very exploitative of the local communities within which they operate. This system of exploitation and impunity is as a result of a multiplicity of actors, including corporations, the host state, which is the state where the victims are located and where the negative human rights impacts occur, and the home state, the state where the parent company, the ultimate company of a network of subsidiaries, is domiciled and incorporated. Access to a remedy for victims of business-related human rights violations is the third pillar of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights acknowledge that effective judicial mechanisms are at the core of ensuring access to a remedy. And this is enshrined in the commentary to Principle 26 of the UN General Principles on Business and Human Rights. This paper focuses upon trends in home states in Europe, in particular the UK and the Netherlands, which are home to some of the largest multinational corporate enterprises in the world. There has been increased efforts in those states to hold parent companies to account for the negative human rights impacts created by their extractive activities in foreign host states. This paper focuses upon litigation in those courts and how there have been recent changes that could arguably be construed as increasing multinational corporate accountability for transnational human rights violations. The paper also points out the limitations adopted by those courts in guarding against impunity for these multinational corporate human rights violations. There are many reasons why victims of multinational corporate human rights violations seek a remedy against the corporation in the home state of the parent company, rather than in the host state where the extractive activities take place and where the victims live. First, corruption and political interference may mean that there will be no real prospect of success in the host state courts. It may compromise the independence of the courts and may mean that the victims will not receive a fair trial. Further, there may be fear of reprisals and intimidation of witnesses in the host state courts, either from the host state authorities who benefit from the extractive activities or the corporations themselves. There also may be a lack of resources within the prosecution bodies to conduct requisite investigations and fact-finding. There may be insufficiency of damages and enforcement problems against the subsidiary in the host state. Sometimes the subsidiary company is liquidated to avoid accountability, for example. There also may be a lack of expertise in multinational corporate litigation in the host state. As Amnesty International stipulated, structural problems, including a weak rule of law, corruption, lack of independence of the courts, and corporate capture, mean that victims cannot access justice in the state hosting the subsidiary sometimes. First, I will consider two recent UK jurisdiction or admissibility cases on transnational corporate litigation. They're very recent cases from 2019 and 2021, and they have been celebrated as significant victories for victims bringing claims against the parent and subsidiary companies in the home state, the UK, for human rights abuses. Vedanta Resources and Lungoa concerned alleged toxic emissions from the Nachanga copper mine in the Kachungola district of Zambia. An action was brought by a group of nearly 2,000 Zambian citizens whose health and farming activities had allegedly been damaged by the toxic discharges from the copper mine. The action was brought against the subsidiary company, Konkola Copper Mines, or KCM, which is a Zambian company based in Zambia running the mine, and Vedanta Resources Limited, the parent company, which was incorporated and domiciled in the UK. Both actions were brought in UK courts. Okpabi and Royal Dutch Shell involved over 40,000 individuals from the Ogale Kingdom and the Bile Kingdom in the Rivers State, Nigeria. Both groups claimed numerous oil spills had occurred from oil pipelines in the vicinity of their communities, causing widespread environmental damage to the extent that they could not safely drink the water, could not fish, and engage in agriculture. The pipeline operator was Shell Petroleum Development Company of Nigeria, a Nigerian registered company. This was a subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell, a UK domiciled company and parent company of the multinational Shell Group. Both cases concern questions of jurisdiction and admissibility. In order to establish jurisdiction in each case, it needed to be determined whether there was a real case to be tried against the parent company, Vedanta Resources and Royal Dutch Shell, respectively, or whether the claim against the parent company was a sham, brought solely for strategic reasons to ensure that the case against the subsidiary companies could be heard in the UK, rather than in Zambia and Nigeria, respectively. The UK courts could only find jurisdiction in relation to the actions against the parent and the subsidiary if there was a real case to be tried against the parent companies that were incorporated in the UK. So as I've said, Vedanta Resources and Lungoa concerned toxic emissions from the Nachanga copper mine in the Chongola district of Zambia and concerned nearly 2,000 Zambian citizens whose health and farming activities had been damaged by the toxic discharges. It was owned by a Zambian company, KCM, in Zambia, and Vedanta Resources was the ultimate parent company, incorporated and domiciled in the UK. At the time of this decision, EU law provided that English courts had jurisdiction over English domiciled parent companies under Article 4 of the recast Brussels regulations, so EU law of private international law, which provides that persons domiciled in an EU member state shall be sued in the courts of that member state. In English common law, the necessary or proper party gateway of the civil procedures rules allows English courts to assert personal jurisdiction over non-EU domiciled defendants, the foreign subsidiary of an English-based transnational corporation, where another claim is made against a locally domiciled anchor defendant, that is, an English domiciled parent company. But in order to bring a case against the foreign company, there must be a real issue to be tried against the anchor defendant, the UK parent company. So it needed to be established that there was a real issue to be tried against Vedanta, the UK parent company, and that the claim against Vedanta was not a sham brought solely for strategic reasons to ensure that KCM was heard in the UK rather than in Zambia, where there would be a lower prospect of success. To establish that there was a real issue, one needed to establish that Vedanta owed a duty of care in tort law, in private law, towards the affected local community. Lord Briggs found that a parent company may incur a duty of care in 3 circumstances when it lays down group-wide guidelines for all of its subsidiaries. So whenever there is a parent company, they will lay down group-wide guidelines as to how they conduct their business in relation to environmental concerns and labour concerns and other interactions with the local community. So the circumstances under which a parent will incur a duty of care and therefore be accountable in some way towards the victims of the subsidiary harm, is where there are systemic errors in those guidelines which might cause harm to the third parties. So if the guidelines themselves are not robust enough to protect the victims, then the parent company will have a duty of care towards the affected party. A duty of care may arise when there are no systemic errors in the guidelines, but when the parent company actively takes steps to implement the guidelines in relation to one of its subsidiaries. So when a parent company produces guidelines and then actively takes some form of responsibility to implement the guidelines in respect of one of its subsidiaries that might be struggling, then a duty of care may arise between the parent company and the victims of the subsidiary harm or negligence. And this could be by training, supervision, and enforcement. Third, the parent company may incur a duty of care to the affected local communities if, in published materials, it merely holds itself out as exercising that degree of supervision and control of its subsidiaries, even if it in fact does not do so. So if in the guidelines that it produces on environmental protections, it says that we will take responsibility for the environmental protections that are put in place by our subsidiaries, then the parent company could incur a duty of care and thus be held liable for negligence towards the victims in that territory. Its very omission may constitute the abdication of a responsibility which it has publicly undertaken. So Vedanta asserted in published materials that it was responsible for the maintenance of proper standards of environmental control of KCM, the Zambian subsidiary activities. It did not only lay down standards, it implemented those standards by training, monitoring, and enforcement. Therefore, Vedanta owed a duty of care to the claimants for the purposes of establishing jurisdiction, and the case against KCM and Vedanta could be brought in UK courts. So this was an inadmissibility decision. It was successful for the victims, or the alleged victims of the Zambian subsidiary. However, Vedanta settled the claim before it went to trial on the merits, and Vedanta did not admit liability, but provided an undisclosed amount of compensation to the victims. This is a significant decision in finding that it was possible to find a duty of care between the parent company and victims of subsidiary human rights impacts. So the attribution of harm suffered by victims to parent company. But one can see that the reasoning of the case is problematic. According to the reasoning of Lord Briggs, if Vedanta held itself out as not exercising any responsibility for KCM and its environmental controls, a company off which it profited multi-millions, then there would not have been any liability. So if Vedanta had said that it was not responsible for its subsidiary activities, there would not have been any liability, despite the fact that this company makes very significant profits off the subsidiary. This obviously disincentivizes multinational corporations in the UK from taking any responsibility for the environmental impacts of their subsidiaries overseas. And this is of a deep concern. Similar issues arise in Okpabi and Royal Dutch Shell. So as I said, the claimants were over 40,000 individuals from the Rivers State in Nigeria. It involved allegations of numerous oil spills that had occurred from oil pipelines in the vicinity of their communities, causing widespread environmental damage to the extent that they could not safely drink the water or engage in agriculture. This again raised the question of whether there was an arguable case that the UK parent company owed the claimants a duty of care in order to attract jurisdiction in UK courts. And the pipeline operator was a Nigerian registered company, a subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell, a UK domiciled company and parent company of the multinational Shell Group. Lord Hamblin reasoned in light of the Supreme Court decision in Vedanta. He had to decide if there was a real issue to be tried against the parent company. And he stated that there should not be much detail in adjudicating this existence of a duty of care. Only you need to establish an arguable case against the parent company, and the burden of proof lies on Shell to present evidence that demonstrated that the claims made were untrue. So this was a very high threshold for the burden of proof that Shell had to overcome in order to avoid jurisdiction. So Lord Hamblin framed the question, are there reasonable grounds for believing that disclosure may materially add to or alter the evidence relevant to whether the claim had a real prospect of success? Which means that there was a real high threshold for not bringing this case forward to the merits, which was a good thing. Lord Hamblin confirmed in relation to the duty of care that the parent company may incur a duty of care when it holds itself out as exercising that degree of supervision and control over its subsidiaries, even if it does not in fact do so. So here we see again, though, that the prima facie duty of care is established along the lines of the Vedanta reasoning, that when the parent company holds itself out as exercising that degree of supervision and control of its subsidiaries, then a duty of care may be established for the purposes of jurisdiction and admissibility. And the claimants did successfully prove that the parents had held itself out as exercising a certain degree of supervision over the subsidiary that could give rise to liability. So these cases have been noted because they do represent some positive developments of UK transnational corporate litigation. It is argued that it increases the likelihood of being able to sue a subsidiary and a parent company in the home state, where there would not be access to a remedy in the host state. One reason for this is that they state that this line of case law results in a narrowing significance of the forum non conveniens rule. Forum non conveniens is a discretionary power of a court to decline jurisdiction to hear a case when another court is better suited to hear it. It is a common law doctrine which allows a court to dismiss a civil action where an appropriate and more convenient alternative forum exists in which to try the action. So the forum non conveniens principle is based on a rule of comity, upholding the foreign relations between states by respecting state sovereignty. So forum non conveniens allegedly tries to say that the host state is capable of holding that civil litigation, and it may be offensive for a foreign court to try that litigation. A number of factors are taken into account when deciding if the case can be adjudicated in the host state or the foreign court. The convenience and expense of holding the proceedings in a foreign court, the law to be applied, the desirability of avoiding multiple proceedings or avoiding conflicting decisions, and in the enforcement of the judgment. So sometimes the rules of forum non conveniens point to the fact that the host state is the most convenient forum. For example, a more convenient forum may be one where the victims are resident, where the harm took place, and where the perpetrator of the harm is located. If you take all those factors together, the courts could have rejected jurisdiction in the Lungoa and Okapi cases, and there would have been no remedy for the victims because of the obstacles to actually having the case litigated in the host state, in Zambia or Nigeria. One reason for arguing that this new line of UK case law improves accountability is that it narrows the significance of the forum non-convenience rule. In the Court of Appeal judgment in Longoa and Vedanta, the judge interpreted EU private international law, Article 4 of the recast Brussels regulations, and the Court of Justice of the European Union case, Owusu and Jackson, as prohibiting the operation of the forum non-convenience rules. So Owusu and Jackson decided that English courts could not decline jurisdiction over a claim against a defendant company domiciled in England. So the English courts did not have a choice. They had to try a real case brought against a parent company in England. And this increased the likelihood that the victim could seek justice in a UK court. As of the 1st of January 2021, following Brexit, the departure of the UK from the EU, there is a resurgence of forum non-convenience. English courts have regained discretionary powers to rely on common rules and decline jurisdiction against both the parent company and the subsidiary when appropriate. The Supreme Court in Vedanta in 2019 had voiced reservations that England would always be the appropriate forum in these cases. So the English courts had already resisted EU private international law, which provided an assumption that the case could be tried in UK prior to officially leaving the EU. So in the Supreme Court in the Vedanta was very different to the Court of Appeal 2017 case. It adjudicated upon forum non-convenience, finding that Zambia was the proper place for proceedings, but it would be practically impossible for rural Zambian villagers living in extreme poverty to fund complex proceedings. Further, the absence of Zambian lawyers experienced to handle mass tort litigation would impact the effectiveness of the trial. In this way, we can see that the limitations on the obstacles posed by forum non-convenience, because there is an exception to forum non-convenience and trying in the proper place, and that's when there would be a substantial injustice. So this is just to emphasize the fact that the forum non-convenience rule has sort of just survived the whole new approach to UK transnational litigation. So there's not much of a change in this regard, even though this litigation has been celebrated for implementing EU law. That has sort of been curbed by Brexit and also by the maintenance of this forum non-convenience rule, which may not be that dangerous when we consider the substantial injustice exception. So another positive development is that a duty of care can be established between the parent company and victims of subsidiary harm. Technically, the corporate veil remains intact. The corporate veil has not been pierced. A parent company is not automatically liable for the acts or omissions of its subsidiary. A victim must prove that a separate direct duty of care of the parent exists. But this case law widens the circumstances in which such a duty may arise. Although these decisions are only a cursory adjudication of whether a duty of care exists, in order to determine whether the case is admissible or not, it still may be instructive to a case that goes to trial and goes to the merits of the case. So that is a positive development. As we know, the three grounds upon which a duty of care may be established is when there are systemic errors in the guidelines, when the parent company actively takes steps to implement the guidelines, and when in the published materials it holds itself out as exercising a degree of supervision and control over its subsidiaries, even if it doesn't do so. This discourages parent companies from exercising due diligence. This is in violation of international soft law norms, so non-binding norms, but extremely authoritative norms in the international normative landscape, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which states in Principle 17 that in order to identify, prevent, and mitigate and account for how they address their adverse human rights impacts, business enterprises should carry out human rights due diligence. The process should include assessing actual and potential human rights impacts, integrating and acting upon the findings, tracking responses, and communicating how impacts are addressed. And in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, paragraph 12 of the general principles stipulates that the businesses and enterprises must seek to prevent or mitigate an adverse impact where they have not contributed to that impact, when the impact is nevertheless directly linked to their operations. So we can see that a principle of due diligence, an enterprise who actually benefits financially from subsidiary activities needs to take active steps to prevent subsidiaries creating environmental damage and also posing harm to local communities. Whereas the tort framework encourages them not to have anything to do with their subsidiaries in order to avoid liability. A parent company is more likely to be liable in tort if only one of its subsidiaries causes particular concern, rather than all of its subsidiaries or a significant number of them. So a duty of care will be owed when the parent company actively takes steps to implement the guidelines in relation to one of its subsidiaries. So when one of its subsidiaries is exceptionally bad at complying with the guidelines and the parent company reaches out to aid them in some way, then that increases the likelihood of liability. But if it is problematic across the network of subsidiaries, then it is unlikely to attract liability under tort law. The more widespread and systemic the harm to people's health and environment, the less likely the court will have jurisdiction to hear the case. The duty of care does not extend to parent company liability for foreign security force human rights impacts in the extractive industry. So this duty of care does not extend to parent company liability for foreign security force human rights impacts. In Cadi Calma, the UK High Court and Court of Appeal found no duty of care arising between a parent company in the UK and victims of alleged human rights violations committed by the Sierra Leone police in Sierra Leone. African Minerals was the parent company in the UK, and they owned and operated the largest iron ore mine in Tonkalili, Sierra Leone. The applicants were local villagers, and they complained that they had been displaced from their homes and farms. The whole village of Ferringbea had to be moved to a new location, which became known as New Ferringbea. The villagers complained that the company was encroaching on land without a license. Compensation for their troubles had not been paid or had been corruptly diverted into pockets of those whose responsibility it was to distribute it, were the allegations posited by the villagers. Further, it was alleged that the activities of the mine had negative environmental impacts. African Minerals provided food, drink, accommodation, vehicles, and payment to Sierra Leone police to maintain security in and around the mine. On 2 occasions, the Sierra Leone police used disproportionate force against local individuals. In 2010, the police used tear gas and detained protesters within the compound of the mining company. In 2012, when the workers in the mine went on strike, the Sierra Leone Human Rights Commission reported that over 3 days, more than 200 police indiscriminately shot, looted, beat up, sexually assaulted, and detained local people in the community of Bambuna. Over 140 applicants brought a case in UK courts against the parent company, African Minerals Limited, for its alleged responsibility for the police brutality in tort for battery, trespass to goods, false arrest and false imprisonment. The UK courts found there was no duty of care between African Minerals and the police, and therefore that there had been no claim of negligence found. The principles developed in Vedanta and Okpabi concerning the link between a parent and a subsidiary company did not extend to the link between a parent company and police force that they were financing to protect their industry and protect their extractive industry. So I want to move on to the Netherlands case, which again, this is a very celebrated case in Europe. It is the first appeals case in Europe that resulted in a victory on the merits for the victims. It is also the first case to hold that a parent company was under a duty of care with regard to foreign victims of subsidiary harm. The case concerns 3 separate incidents of oil spills in the Niger Delta, which caused severe damage to local farmlands and fishing grounds. It involves the same claimants and defendants as in Okpabi and Royal Dutch Shell in England. The Nigerian claimants argued that Shell Nigeria and the parent company, Shell, were liable for negligent maintenance of the pipelines and an inadequate response to the spills and insufficient cleanup. In accordance with the rules of private international law, Nigerian law was applicable in this case. Sources of Nigerian federal civil law include English law and Nigerian law and jurisprudence. English law in force in Nigeria includes the common law of England and the doctrines of equity. English court judgments dating after Nigeria's independence in 1960 is not formally binding on Nigerian courts, but it does have persuasive authority and is often followed in Nigerian jurisprudence. In terms of English common law duty of care, Nigerian law recognizes liability for pure omissions. Negligence is the omission or failure to do something which a reasonable man under similar circumstances would do, or something a reasonable man would not do. And soft law is taken into account when establishing a duty of care. So the environmental guidelines and standards for the petroleum industry in Nigeria, published by the Department of Petroleum Resources, are significant sources of soft law. In establishing whether the parent company, Shell, owed a duty of care towards the claimant in Nigerian law, the UK Supreme Court Vedanta decision was relied upon because it was found to be applicable in Nigerian law. The court restates and provides its own interpretation of the Vedanta decision. If the parent knows or should know that their subsidiary is unlawfully causing harm to third party in an area in which the parent interferes with the subsidiary, then the starting point rests on the parent, a duty of care towards those third parties to intervene. The court found that in order to hold Shell liable, the parent company, for a duty of care, it needed to first establish whether the subsidiary acted negligently. This is a departure from the UK court approach, which did not require an assessment of whether the subsidiary was actually negligent. But the English court decisions were admissibility decisions, and this is a decision on the merits. It was found that there was no proof that the Nigerian subsidiary had acted negligently in relation to the creation of the leakage. It had been caused by sabotage. Therefore, Shell, the parent company, did not have a duty of care towards the claimants in preventing the leak. In terms of responding to the leak, it was found that a lack of timely installation of a leak detection system was as a result of the Nigerian subsidiary. So the Shell company could be held accountable for not installing a leak detection system. So the court found that the question of whether the parent is liable is not so much a question of whether the parent interferes generally with the subsidiary, but, as Shell argued, The issue is whether that interference extends to the acts of the subsidiary which were negligent. So the liability of Shell was limited to installing a leak detection system. This fails to adopt an approach that incorporates a concept of due diligence, an obligation to prevent the leak, to prevent third parties from tampering with the oil pipeline, an obligation to prevent the environmental damage that ensues and the significant harms created by the environmental damage. The capacity of tort law, therefore, to articulate a concept of due diligence on parent companies to prevent subsidiaries creating terrible environmental and other civil and political human rights violations in local communities is very limited. The tort law framework is not adequate. Could a human rights approach be more efficient and more effective in preventing these kinds of harms in the extraterritorial context? I believe that the international human rights framework could be more effective. It has in place a regime whereby a state is required to take steps to prevent human rights violations from happening. The duty bearer is the state, but then there is an obligation on the state to impose sanctions and obligations on corporations in private law. In the European system, we see this in for example, the Tatar and Romania decision. So a violation of the European Convention on Human Rights arose as a result of a cyanide spill in a gold mine owned and operated by a private corporation. 100,000 cubic meters of contaminated water was released into rivers crossing Romania, Hungary, Serbia, and Bulgaria. The Romanian applicants claimed that the operation of the mine entailed serious human rights violations. The state was found to have failed in their positive duties to carry out effective regulation of the activities of the mining corporation, which had affected rivers running through many different states. The state failed to provide. Oh, yes?
Yeah. Okay. You have 3 minutes. Is that okay for you?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Yes.
All right.
So I'll finish then very briefly. So this was a case which obviously showed that the state could be held liable for not imposing better civil, administrative, and criminal complaints against the plaintiff. We're also aware of the Inter-American Court, which issued an advisory opinion providing that states will be held accountable for failure in preventing a corporation located in its territory from producing transboundary environmental harm in another state. So this was an advisory opinion requested by the Republic of Colombia which asked the court to clarify the scope of responsibility for environmental harm in light of the Convention for Protection and Development of Marine Environment. And the court in this instance stated that it is understood that the person whose rights have been breached fall within the jurisdiction of the state of origin if there is a causal link between the facts occurring in its territory and the violation of the human rights of people outside of its territory. This means that if there is a causal link between arguably between what the parent company does in the UK, for example, and what the subsidiary does in the host state or the foreign territory, then under a human rights approach, there may be obligations on the state to ensure that its UK parent company takes measures to prevent the human rights impacts in the foreign state. So I propose that a human rights approach may be a better way forward, and that the developments made in Europe have their limitations. And thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you very much. I'm very proud of you, actually. Your presentation was very complete. It's about some African cases, and in the final South American cases, it was very, very good. And I have one question, actually. Maybe it's the first question. Let's organize our panel like this. Jane had her presentation. Now we have some questions for her. And after that, we have the second speech. Do you think it's better like this way? É melhor fazer as perguntas no final? Acha melhor? Então vamos para Jane. Let's organize like this. We're going to have now the second presentation, and at the end we have all questions. Is that okay?
Yep, that's perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. Então, pessoal, vamos agora para a segunda apresentação. Eu já ia fazer a pergunta para Jane, já ia direcionar os questionamentos. Vamos agora para o nosso segundo palestrante, da mesa Direitos, Humanos, Fronteiras e Relações Internacionais. Deixa eu fazer a apresentação, professor Alex Magalhães. Alex é mestrando em Direitos Humanos na Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, com ênfase em estudos jus transnacionais e lógica colonial, especialista em filosofia e teoria do direito pela Pontifícia Universidade Católica de Minas Gerais, bacharel em Direito pelo Centro Universitário do Vale de Pojuca, o qual teve sua monografia publicada pela revista Luso-Brasileira da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de Lisboa. Então, eu imediatamente passo a palavra para Alex, sem muitas delongas. Vamos lá, Alex. Eu vou compartilhar aqui a minha tela para que Alex possa falar e fazer a sua apresentação. Deixa eu... Alex, tu me avisa quando estiver aparecendo, tá? Pronto, já está aparecendo?
Alex? Olá, Alex Magalhães, como o professor Pedro me apresentou. Eu sou colaborador do grupo de pesquisa em contemporaneidade, subjetividade e novas epistemologias da UPE, coordenado pelo professor Fernando Cardoso. Então, eu gostaria, primeiramente, de agradecer o convite na pessoa do professor Pedro e do professor Elton, para estar aqui compondo essa mesa, Direitos Humanos, Fronteiras e Relações Internacionais. Bom, hoje eu gostaria de falar sobre os direitos humanos, mais especificamente no âmbito da justiça de transição. Pode passar, Pedro, o slide. Ou a partir dos campos de ação, como memória, verdade, justiça e reparação, evidenciando o passado recente das violações de direitos humanos dos povos indígenas enquanto fronteira móvel, a ser enfrentada por nós, pesquisadores ou trabalhadores da memória, do tempo presente. E a consequente alienação que existe no processo justicional brasileiro. Até porque o conceito de fronteira, no âmbito dos direitos humanos, ele vai muito além das fronteiras geopolíticas, como a fronteira social, imaginária, teórica e política. Então, falam que a ditadura acabou, mas para os povos indígenas, não. Então, a ditadura, ela representa mais um capítulo violento na história de luta e resistência dos povos indígenas no Brasil, especificamente entre os períodos que demarcam as duas últimas constituições formalmente democráticas. Nesse período, sobre as graves violações de direitos humanos, o aparato estatal colocou os indígenas na condição de inimigos internos, ao passo que ressignificou a própria violência colonial, agrária, burguesa e de gênero, a qual gestou o país enquanto nação, sobretudo a partir do sofrimento de pessoas indígenas. Pode passar, por favor. Assim, a relação entre ditadura militar e povos indígenas, ela pode ser considerada uma relação complexa. Por quê? Sob o argumento de proteger as existências indígenas, o Estado acabou matando e destruindo. Então, o Estado brasileiro, sob o comando militar, ele defendia o caminho da integração à civilização. Então, com isso, armou-se a integração dos indígenas ao projeto modernizador e desenvolvimentista dos militares. Os contornos das violações de direitos humanos dos povos indígenas, elas perpassam obrigatoriamente por códigos de arbitrariedade, que se traduzem em invasão de terras, deslocamentos forçados, torturas, aprisionamento e extermínio, subordinação e a propagação de epidemias. E tais violências não são esporádicas, nem acidentais. Elas são sistêmicas, ou seja, resultado direto das políticas estruturais de Estado, tanto por ação quanto por omissão. Então, esses fatos significaram a morte de mais de 8 mil indígenas, segundo o trabalho investigativo da Comissão Nacional da Verdade, no capítulo intitulado Violações de Direitos Humanos dos Povos Indígenas, o que, assustadoramente, apresenta disparidade em relação ao número de 430 mortos e desaparecidos políticos não indígenas da ditadura brasileira, em decorrência da ação ou omissão dos seus agentes. Então, hoje, falar em mortes e desaparecidos políticos na ditadura militar no Brasil, a gente não deve mais se referir aos 430 mortos e desaparecidos no sentido de dizer que foi uma dita branda, que, na verdade, foi uma ditadura, onde houve a morte de mais de 8 mil indígenas. Então, hoje, os dados são esses, 8.350 indígenas, e ao menos, porque as estatísticas elas apontam para mais, mas desencorajaram a Comissão Nacional da Verdade em expor esses dados, até porque o relatório ele tem certas limitações. A gente prefere encarar o relatório da Comissão Nacional da Verdade como estado da arte ou como ponto de partida, para a gente poder pensar as violações de direitos humanos no período ditatorial. Então, é durante a ditadura militar que vai se formar um poderoso imaginário sobre os povos indígenas, que impede ainda hoje a reflexão da realidade. Então, na ditadura, os indígenas eram vistos como um empecilho ao progresso da nação. E como os territórios habitados por eles foram tidos enquanto vazios estratégicos, desprovidos de segurança, surge então o indígena como perigo à ordem nacional. Então, foram episódios como estes que fizeram do indígena um dos principais objetos de controle do regime militar. Pode passar, por favor. Desde o processo de colonização do Brasil, a questão indígena ela tem sido marcada por relações complexas de dominação e resistência, que podem ser entendidas enquanto mecanismos de legitimação e traços do processo de colonização, quais sejam o projeto de catequização dos indígenas e a exploração do trabalho e expropriação de terras. São lógicas que na prática foram traduzidas pelo Estado e seus agentes de governo em ações como barganha, domínio, extermínio, povoamento, subalternização, segregação, silenciamento, entre outros. Assim, o colonialismo e o militarismo, no caso brasileiro, constituem duas faces de uma mesma moeda, ou seja, a expropriação dos povos indígenas da sua condição de existência. Se anteriormente os colonos eles fizeram isso nos contextos autoritários entre 46 e 85, foram o militarismo e as forças armadas que ressignificaram esse discurso a fim de instrumentalizar práticas de violência. Agora, eu farei uso do termo lógica colonial para me referir à subsunção do colonialismo ao militarismo, no caso brasileiro, e seus desdobramentos para a questão indígena, ao me utilizar da atuação dos órgãos ou mecanismos que funcionaram durante a ditadura militar no Brasil ou de continuidades coloniais. Então, enquanto órgãos de controle que funcionaram durante a ditadura militar, a gente vai ter o SPI, o Serviço de Proteção ao Índio. Ele foi formado a partir de premissas positivistas, então ele funcionava através de atração dos indígenas, contextos que foram adotadas práticas missionárias que tinham por objetivo a entrega de presentes, vestir indígenas e ensinar costumes ocidentais. Outro fator que marca a atuação desse órgão é a sua função e atuação contraditória, que buscava proteger os indígenas, ao mesmo tempo que desencadeava processos de transferência territorial, além de toda a corrupção que permeava o SPI. Em decorrência desse ambiente, foi formada em 1967 uma comissão de inquérito para investigar as irregularidades do SPI, presidida pelo procurador Jardim Figueiredo. Desde as suspeitas de corrupção do órgão, os crimes praticados pelos civis e militares contra os indígenas iam muito além da usurpação de seus bens. Envolvia tanto assassinatos, prostituição, trabalho escravo, espancamento, a trituração dos seus tornozelos, o cárcere privado, a apropriação e o desvio de recursos oriundos de seus territórios. Então, esse contexto levou à extinção do SPI e à criação da FUNAI, em 1967, que, de certa forma, ela seguiu as práticas do seu órgão antecessor, mas ela moderniza essas ações e as justifica em termos de desenvolvimento nacional, no intuito de acelerar a integração dos indígenas. A Fundação Nacional do Índio, ela manteve centros de detenção para indígenas infratores no interior de Minas Gerais, o Reformatório Krenak ou o Presídio Indígena e a Fazenda Guarani, criados na década de 60 e 70. Então, para estes locais, comandados por policiais militares, foram levados mais de 100 indígenas das mais diversas etnias, inclusive rivais, das 5 regiões do país, onde ocorria toda sorte de violência contra os indígenas, como confinamento em solitária, chicotadas, desaparecimentos e o trabalho forçado. Já a Guarda Rural Indígena, que foi outro mecanismo, né, de controle da ditadura militar, ela era formada por indígenas de diversas regiões do país, com abrangência nacional e treinada pela polícia militar. Esse mecanismo ele foi criado para desempenhar ações de monitoramento ostensivo nas áreas indígenas, na tentativa de demonstrar à sociedade que os indígenas patrulhavam o seu próprio povo. Tal como o reformatório Krenak, a GRIN ela decorre de medidas de militarização da política indigenista e da repressão do Estado autoritário brasileiro. Assim, situações como estas corroboram para a compreensão de que houve a subsunção do colonialismo ao militarismo no caso brasileiro, a partir das relações de poder que foram constituídas nesse contexto, como fundamento do processo sistemático das violações de direitos humanos dos povos indígenas. Pode passar, por favor. Então, percebe-se que a pandemia ela tem desvelado, em certos momentos, né? Ela desvelou, né? No caso, em certos... Deu um delay. Percebe-se que a pandemia desvelou, em certos momentos, a expropriação dos corpos pandêmicos da sua condição de existência, tal como na ditadura, que ocultou números e corpos. Então, seriam esses corpos pandêmicos os novos mortos e desaparecidos políticos? Então, essa questão me faz refletir e caminhar para a compreensão de que existe, de fato, no processo de transição, traços de lógica colonial, que constrói condição de subalternidade em torno dos grupos minorizados, em especial sobre povos indígenas, vez que os processos de violações urbanas de direito de homens, em sua maioria branco, grandes figuras políticas e líderes militantes. Ou seja, as reparações no âmbito da justiça de transição, elas têm ficado restritas às violações urbanas de direito, né? De homens, em sua maioria brancos, e grandes figuras políticas, militantes e líderes. Então, conforme os ditames do direito internacional, a justiça de transição pode ser compreendida por meio de seus eixos de atuação, seja memória, verdade, justiça, reparação e reformas institucionais. E tais medidas são necessárias aos processos de transição de regimes autoritários para democráticos. Nesse sentido, eu busco aqui oferecer o que chamo de campos de reflexão para toda e qualquer reunião de aportes críticos com o objetivo de repensar a justiça de transição. Pois é preciso questionar o argumento de que a justiça de transição ela não esgotou, em seu processo de busca pela verdade, a ruptura com a lógica colonial, por desvelar implicitamente práticas opressivas, subalternizantes e segregacionistas. Quando se fala da concepção tradicional de justiça de transição, retoma-se a ideia de centralização da justiça punitiva, que implica na subalternização das vítimas e deixa suas experiências em segundo plano, devido ao legalismo e à centralidade do Estado em sua programação. Precisa-se, então, que a justiça de transição delimite ou expanda suas fronteiras de atuação e, antes de materializar em uma sociedade pós-ditatorial, ela requeira estar alinhada com o histórico de colonialismo e escravismo do país. Então, a partir dessas informações, eu procurei propor campos de reflexão à justiça de transição a partir de aportes críticos, pós-coloniais e anti-hegemônicos. Então, Judith Butler, ela chama atenção para os enquadramentos, ao assinalar que os discursos modelam, classificam, hierarquizam e enquadram a vida das pessoas. Então, esses enquadramentos, de acordo com a filósofa, eles atuam para diferenciar as vidas que podemos aprender daquelas que não podemos. Então, no âmbito da justiça transicional, é possível falar em enquadramentos, como é o caso dos grupos tidos enquanto minoritários ou vulneráveis. Basta estudar o relatório da Comissão Nacional da Verdade para identificar que os povos indígenas eles foram considerados como se fosse um quadro pintado de mortos, porque as violações de direitos humanos dos povos indígenas elas não estão incluídas no capítulo das graves violações de direitos humanos. Os povos indígenas eles ganharam um capítulo temático para se referir às suas violações. E o relatório também não reconhece o genocídio dos povos indígenas e a remoção forçada de seus territórios no âmbito das graves violações de direitos humanos. Dessa forma, foi relegado aos povos indígenas o lugar da subalternidade, vez que as principais vítimas estudadas pela Comissão Nacional são pessoas brancas, estudantes, militares, militantes de esquerda e intelectuais. Já a perspectiva de uma justiça anamnética para a justiça transicional se mostra necessária para o enfrentamento das disfunções hierárquicas presentes em seu escopo, como também da negação da experiência das vítimas, em especial aos grupos minoritários. Nesse sentido, o filósofo Reis Mate, que aponta essa teoria habitual da justiça, ele vai dizer que essa não considera pertinente a assuntos que têm a ver com a memória das vítimas dos mortos do irreparável. Então, as violações de direitos humanos dos povos indígenas, elas estão ligadas com as questões territoriais, mas ainda além em relação à memória. E a nossa justiça, por centralizar a justiça punitiva, acaba não trabalhando o campo das memórias. Então, a ideia de se buscar uma justiça étnico-coletiva para a reparação territorial dos indígenas pode se mostrar um espelho importante para situar os quadros dos transicionais, ainda mais se estiver associado a uma perspectiva racializada. Os autores Garavito e Lan, em suas proposições, eles vão recomendar a incorporação de um novo juízo crítico, a justiça de transição, que seria a justiça étnico-coletiva, com foco nos processos de reparação. Então, falar desses campos de reflexão, seja em forma de enquadramentos ou de se buscar uma justiça anamnética, que seria a justiça das vítimas, ou mesmo uma reparação étnico-coletiva, me fez também empreender uma reflexão, mesmo que inicial, para pensar a comissão de anistia enquanto tecnologia ou burocracia colonial, pois o processo de reparação das graves violações de direitos humanos ele é passível de crítica, especialmente no tocante ao procedimento de escuta desses processos. E apesar de ser um órgão de característica jurídica, não é um tribunal, mas, ao final, ele assume a racionalidade tribunalesca. Então, a amnésia, enquanto sustentáculo da ênfase meramente econômica dessa reparação, e que pode estar relacionada com a lógica colonial, mesmo após o fim das suas administrações. Como a gente tem debatido, né? O colonialismo, ele formalmente acaba, mas ele deixa a colonialidade ou as continuidades coloniais. Então, desse contexto, emergiram algumas tensões. A primeira é, por mais que a questão territorial esteja no centro das violações de direitos humanos dos povos indígenas, a lei de anistia ela não prevê forma coletiva de reparação. A comissão de anistia ela está restrita na legislação. Ela não equipara a experiência vivida pelos indígenas com a prática de tortura ou perseguição política, por entender que estas ocorreram de modo individualizado ou no meio urbano. E os danos físicos, materiais e psicológicos, as práticas de invasão, deslocamento, remoção e trabalho forçado sofridas por esses povos, elas foram reputadas enquanto um ambiente de exceção, e não atos de exceção. Então, está aí o grande problema da justiça de transição brasileira, porque ela tem uma série de problemáticas que não garantem uma reparação de fato das violações de direitos humanos. Então, é preciso que a gente sempre esteja repensando a justiça de transição, ainda mais por ser um campo relativamente novo do conhecimento, ela possui há pouco mais de 2 décadas, Então, é preciso que a gente desloque, né? Saia um pouco da teorização padrão e proponha leituras críticas a esse processo transicional. Pode passar, Pedro. Em 2019, eu tive a oportunidade de fazer uma pesquisa empírica na Comissão de Anistia, em Brasília, que à época era custodiada pelo Ministério da Justiça, com o objetivo de localizar processos de reparação dos povos indígenas. Então, acho que travou aqui o meu slide. Então, desses processos, haviam 138 processos em todo o seu acervo da Comissão de Anistia, de 138 processos. Só que em trâmite havia 114 e apenas 15 foram indeferidos. Então, o que me chamou a atenção, primeiramente, nesses dados, como a gente tem 138 processos e apenas 15 foram deferidos, em detrimento a 8.000 indígenas que foram mortos durante a ditadura militar, me fez questionar qual era o lugar dos povos indígenas na Comissão de Anistia, ou não lugar. Porque de 138 processos indígenas, apenas 15 foram deferidos, então, ao meu ver, se manifesta o lugar da subalternidade em relação à experiência indígena para o processo de construção democrática brasileira. E outra questão que me chamou bastante a atenção, pode passar, Pedro, o slide. É sobre o processo étnico, né, dos processos de trâmite na Comissão de Anistia. Então, os processos que estão em trâmite, eles revelam apenas 5 povos que foram até a Comissão de Anistia pedir reparação, que são os Aiquenwara, os Paracanã, os Kayapó, os Krenak e os Guiaraocá. Então, esses povos, eles foram pedir reparação à Comissão de Anistia, mas apenas um grupo de 14 indígenas da etnia Aiquenwara foram reparados. Outra questão que envolve esses processos que me chamaram a atenção é que, como a Justiça de Transição ela não repara de forma coletiva os povos indígenas, como a Organização Internacional do Trabalho ela prevê, e as sentenças da Corte Interamericana de Direitos Humanos, elas têm reparado individualmente. E parece que não vai haver mais nenhum tipo de reparação neste governo. Então, os povos indígenas se encontram em situação de paralisação dos seus processos, e ainda bem que houve essa reparação individual, mas que, de fato, é necessária uma reparação coletiva, para que não se abra precedentes de que os povos indígenas eles ingressem na Comissão de Anistia com pedidos individuais. Por exemplo, os Krenak e os Kayapó, eles têm processos coletivos. Já os Aiquenwaras, Paracanãs e Guiaraocás são processos individuais. Pode passar, Pedro. Então, aqui neste último slide, eu queria falar sobre como é que a gente pode pensar essa colonialidade, no caso brasileiro, tendo a ditadura militar como mote. Eu não sei se vocês têm estudado as teorias da colonialidade, mas que é algo que tem me movido para pensar essa colonialidade no caso brasileiro, já que a gente não tem representantes brasileiros no grupo Modernidade e Colonialidade, ou Rede, né, como alguns autores tratam, né? Então, se tratando das ausências e urgências justancionais, estas acabam sendo confrontadas ao se deparar com a matriz colonial do poder e suas formas de atuação, embora existam normativas que garantam direitos humanos dos povos indígenas, se percebe limitações nos eixos da memória, verdade, justiça e reparação. De modo que essas violações elas ocorrem visível e invisivelmente, deixando os povos indígenas em situação de subalternidade. Então, eu começo a pensar, se é o caso que, pela matriz colonial do poder, em sentido amplo, decorrem as colonialidades do poder, do ser e saber, destas, em sentido estrito, emergem outros desdobramentos, e, consequentemente, a possibilidade de pensar outros tipos de colonialidade como aquela que decorre da subsunção do colonialismo ao militarismo, no caso brasileiro, e escoa pelo processo justo-transicional. Então, para pensar essa colonialidade, no caso brasileiro, tendo a ditadura militar como mote, eu tenho observado as formas de controle das sociedades humanas, né, das vítimas. Tenho pensado na configuração do imaginário da ditadura militar nos tempos de hoje, as estratégias, né, de dominação e as formas jurídicas, além do controle político que perfaz todo o discurso, toda a discussão, toda a genealogia da justiça transicional. Então, hoje eu queria trazer para vocês essa reflexão de pegar a ditadura militar como mote para pensar a colonialidade e como ela escoa no processo transicional, uma vez que a gente não rompeu, de fato, né, com a lógica colonial no processo de transição. E a gente ainda guarda em nossa estrutura de Estado democrático resquícios da ditadura militar. Então, pensar a colonialidade, no caso brasileiro, se faz urgente, ainda mais refletida a partir das nossas bases teóricas. Porque muitas vezes a gente tem importado teorizações de fora do Brasil que muitas vezes não se adequam à nossa realidade. Então, ser um pouco crítico nesse sentido. Então, eu encerro minha fala agradecendo a oportunidade e me coloco à disposição para qualquer dúvida.
Pedro, seu microfone está desligado.
Ah, perfeito. Eu estava tirando da apresentação. Alex caiu? Deve ter caído, né?
Eu creio que sim.
Tá. Então, perfeito. Tá, Diogo. Diogo ele acabou de voltar. Bem, vamos começar agora o ciclo de perguntas. Então, eu queria falar para o pessoal que está nos assistindo, se vocês tiverem alguma pergunta para Dr. Jane Rooney e para o professor Alex Magalhães, que vocês fizessem, colocassem aí no chat do YouTube para que a gente possa mostrar aqui na tela, tá bom? E Diogo está responsável aí por fazer essa organização das perguntas. Mas, antes disso, eu queria fazer uma pergunta, uma reflexão para Jane, e depois eu vou colocar para Alex também. Então, Jane, can I ask you a question, please?
Of course, yes. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. First of all, I'd like to say sorry because Alex's presentation was in Portuguese. We didn't have translations for that. Sorry.
No, that's no problem. I mean, the images and the little that I could catch in the words, it looked fantastic, but it's just left me wanting to know more about the presentation, and I'll get in touch with Alex afterwards and ask him further about it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you as well. Jane, could you speak a little more about the limits of Brexit for human rights violations for the cases you brought in your presentation? I mean, I would like to you speak just a little more about the limits of Brexit for the cases you brought in your presentation. So, I'm very curious because Brexit for us is very recent.
Yes, of course. No, thank you, Pedro, and thank you for asking that question. So in relation to these cases I've been looking at, which are transnational civil litigation cases, I think the main concern is that under EU regulations, if a victim from a foreign state wanted to bring a claim against an English company in the UK, for whatever reasons, it just didn't want to pursue them in the host state, then it could under the recast Brussels regulations. Whereas now there is a reliance on this old common law doctrine, the forum non-convenience doctrine, which is really based in traditional concepts of comity, not wishing to offend a foreign state and their ability to litigate a case in an independent way. But there are many arguments to the effect that this won't really cause substantial damage, because there is a very large exception to this forum non-convenience rule, which is where the UK courts decide that the victims wouldn't be able to access justice for whatever reason in the host state, and as a result of perhaps corruption and a lack of political independence, as a result of the corporate capture or the hold that the extractive industry has on the state apparatus. Now, in terms of Brexit, I'm from Northern Ireland, and Brexit has much larger ramifications for that. At the moment, the Northern Ireland Protocol is really under threat, and that has very serious implications. But in relation to this transnational litigation, I think that the private international law and transnational corporate human rights world is hopeful that it won't have too much of an impact actually on this trend towards holding multinational corporations accountable in the UK.
Perfect. So I have another questions about colonialism, because I think the barriers of the European countries and the courts, and included the human rights violations, has all of these set have a direction, a very strong net, a very strong direction to the colonialism and imperialism, European imperialism. So I'm not gonna ask this question because we don't have much time, but we can talk later about this. So,
yes, I feel very strongly about the neo-colonial arguments as well. So all of this has a legacy in colonialism itself, but certainly there's a neo-colonial dimension to it. So that's a fascinating aspect that I need to do more research on.
Yeah, certainly, surely. So, Professor Elton, you said you had a question.
Thank you, Pedro. I would like to pose a question about international law and citizen protection. One of the main assumptions in international relations is the idea of international anarchy. So in general, we tend to look to international law with little confidence. So I ask you, Dr. Roney, do you believe that, with the exception perhaps of the European Union, there is an international organization, economic bloc, or regional integration process really capable of applying effective rules to regulate the actions of multinational enterprises such as oil and mining companies in matters involving vulnerable populations?
Yes, no, thank you very much, Professor Gomez. I mean, it's such an important question. And I think that one of the indicators that I don't have much confidence in international law is that I focus on domestic civil litigation, because that seems to be the only place where there is any movement on multinational corporate accountability. And I know that there is they're drafting a binding UN human rights treaty on business and human rights, but I think it's really, I think it is a David and Goliath situation in every instance. And certainly international relations as a discipline is not very detached from international law, but it does help us to provide a narrative on what we see is happening, and to actually appreciate the scale of impunity and the scale of atrocity committed against, local victims of these atrocities. So, the hegemonic state, and even encompassing multinational corporations as actors in the international relations. International law struggles to see the corporation as an international actor, except whenever the corporation has rights under international law against the state. So international law at the moment is a neo-colonial global north enterprise, and definitely needs to be infiltrated with a third world approach, the TWAIL scholarship, which is, so I kind of echo, Professor Suarez's points about dealing with decolonizing this area of law and recognizing it for what the law is, which is a neo-colonial enterprise, really, because it's not providing adequate accountability and checks on the multinational corporations. And I think international relations scholarship can certainly help us to articulate that and to improve international law, hopefully, in the future.
Perfect. Thank you, Jane, for your answer. Alex, eu tenho uma dúvida sobre a tua apresentação. Quando você traz as teorias decoloniais, tu tem alguma escolha por alguma teoria? Porque você falou de digamos assim, de um ponto de vista muito geral, muito, digamos assim, muito panorâmico. E a minha pergunta é o seguinte: se existe alguma teoria dentro do conjunto das teorias decoloniais que você se vincula, que você traz para o seu trabalho, que eu sei, para o pessoal que está assistindo, eu sei que o trabalho de Alex não é isso apenas que ele mostrou, é algo maior. Então, na verdade, a minha pergunta vai nesse sentido, para que ele possa puxar, né, fazer algum gancho com algumas dessas teorias. Deixa eu inteirar Jane Rooney sobre o que nós estamos falando, pessoal. Jane, we are talking about decolonial theories, and Alex's research is about how Brazilian Indians were violated, their rights were violated in our most recent dictatorship. Yeah, so we are talking about how these decolonial theories explain those violations. So, yeah. Alex.
Bom, Pedro, eu costumo trabalhar com convergências entre a teoria pós-colonial e decolonial. Então, eu costumo trabalhar pensando a concepção de sujeito para esses autores. Mas eu me vinculo principalmente à teoria da colonialidade do poder, proposta por Quijano, né, e expandida por Walter Miolo, mas também reconhecendo as suas limitações e carência de análise prática que requer a teoria da colonialidade do poder. Então, eu busco trabalhar com as ressonâncias, seja com a colonialidade de gênero ou a partir de teorias queer, decoloniais. Mas eu me vinculo às teorias da colonialidade do poder para poder pensar as violações de direitos humanos, no caso brasileiro, que seria aquela proposta por Quijano inicialmente.
Perfeito. Obrigado, Alex. A gente tem aqui uma pergunta de Leonardo Alencar, nosso aluno, direcionada a Dr. Jane Rooney. Jane, we have a question for you. So the question was made by one student, Leonardo Alencar. So can it be said that the practice of corporate lobbying is detrimental to cases involving human rights violations and corporate accountability?
Yes, most definitely. And also the lack of transparency with corporate lobbying. A lot, there's a lack of transparency in relation to the degree to which states engage with corporate lobbying. And I think that is significant in terms of, human rights violations, because under international law, obviously human rights are states are the duty bearers for human rights. And I think that there is a lack of transparency in the extent to which states do engage with corporate lobbying. But there are other things like, the global tax cap and things like that, and just not supporting yeah, I think there's a lot of different factors that go into states supporting corporate practices that are not ethical and that disadvantage people who are not visible within their own state territory, but are affected in foreign states. And that certainly happens in relation to the states that I've mentioned, but most definitely corporate lobbying is detrimental to human rights and corporate accountability.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. Elton, tem uma pergunta para Alex.
Obrigado, professor Pedro. Alex, agradecer e parabenizar por sua apresentação, que toca temas bastante polêmicos e relativamente pouco estudados pelo prisma das teorias pós-modernas, pós-estruturalistas e, nesse caso específico, pós-coloniais no Brasil. Agora, eu tenho uma questão a respeito do horizonte temporal da tua pesquisa. Você fala de justiça de transição, então é bastante razoável que você trabalhe com o período posterior à ditadura militar. Só que a gente sabe que esse processo histórico foi engendrado ao longo de muito tempo. Por exemplo, o SPI, ao qual você fez referência, foi criado na República Velha, em 1910. E pouca coisa se fala, por exemplo, em termos de período autoritário e relação com os povos indígenas, sobre a ditadura do Estado Novo, o período varguista. Eu, por esses dias mesmo, vinha uma reportagem bastante interessante que falava sobre a visita de Vargas ao Centro-Oeste, que ele foi vestido de bandeirante, exaltou as capacidades físicas dos índios, trouxe lá o DPI, o Departamento de Imprensa e Propaganda, o DIP, né, para poder fazer propaganda oficial, vinculando a imagem dos índios chavantes às Forças Armadas. Então eu pergunto, por que pegar especificamente o momento da ditadura militar, se nos seus aspectos mais fundamentais, essa ideia de subordinação, se você pegar aquela perspectiva de Gaetano Spivak, por exemplo, vem desde muito antes disso, né? Pelo menos desde o Primeiro Império, para ser bem generoso em termos históricos.
Bom, como eu coloquei na minha apresentação, o meu marco temporal é de 46 a 88. Então, desde a ditadura do Estado Novo, passando pela ditadura militar. Eu prefiro falar o termo ditadura militar, retirando o civil, para não deslegitimar a resistência social. Mas eu busco trabalhar a partir da década de 40, que é onde a gente tem uma disseminação ali pela marcha do Oeste de uma colonização dirigida, onde a gente vai ter um dos maiores processos de expoliação dos povos indígenas a partir de tudo que foi implantado ali na região em Minas Gerais. E trabalho com a ditadura militar por entender que o processo modernizador, de modernização, no sentido de modernidade, em relação a esses aspectos, eles se engendram de forma mais específica e mais perversas nesse período ditatorial, por entender justamente o que eu proponho de subsunção do militarismo, do colonialismo ao militarismo, no caso brasileiro, porque eu entendo que que esse discurso dessas práticas cometidas e desveladas pelos colonos, os militares e as forças armadas que vão ressignificar esse discurso nesses períodos autoritários. Então, eu costumo trabalhar entre o intervalo das duas últimas constituições democráticas, 46 a 88, para poder estudar as violações de direitos humanos. Por isso que eu escolhi esse assunto, por entender que esse período demarca o campo das grandes violações de direitos humanos no Brasil, em relação a períodos autoritários.
Ok, obrigado.
Perfeito. Pelo adiantar da hora, vamos à última pergunta para Dr. Rooney. Jane, please. We have a question asked by a student, Bianca Florentino. How economically does a company harm itself when it hurts human rights, and how do they get back on its feet so quickly?
Thank you very much, Bianca, for the question. This litigation can actually cause quite significant reputational damage, and that is one of the kind of important factors in engaging with this type of litigation. It's the global reputational damage that a company can suffer. So, for example, with the Vedanta and Longoa case that I was talking about in relation to Zambia, the government tried to file to liquidate that subsidiary company. And because of the UK litigation that had gone forward and the significant reputational damage that was suffered in relation to that, there was significant pressure put on the Zambian government to rethink this step. But this can sometimes happen. Sometimes the subsidiary is liquidated if it is causing such reputational harm to the entire multinational enterprise as a whole. But obviously, there are a lot of assets behind the network of companies in relation to these, huge enterprises. And in relation to, for example, Shell, it has undertaken a huge greenwashing enterprise that it intends to hit a sort of net zero by 2050 in absolute terms. However, this pledge allows Shell to continue using fossil fuel sales for the next 14 years. And the intensity with which it intends to actually limit that fossil fuel consumption is very low. But I do actually think that, and I know other different organizations that do engage in this litigation do rely on the reputational harm. What is problematic is when big companies like Vedanta, after a jurisdiction or admissibility stage, claim that they're not liable and compensate the victims. So obviously it's very good for the victims that they're compensated, but the headline isn't that Vedanta is liable for a breach of tort law for causing these massive environmental harm. It's that it didn't go to trial because it was settled, and that's often the story actually. And I think that a decision on the merits would be really good and useful for propelling forward that reputational damage that these parent companies should suffer. And I think that there's not enough emphasis placed on the financial benefits that the parent companies reap, the multi-billion pounds that they are accruing from the subsidiaries' activities. And then the courts won't establish a duty of care between the parent and the subsidiary harm. I think that's problematic. But if there was more reputational harm, I think it could do more damage and it would make it less easy for them to get back on their feet so quickly. But it's a multifaceted thing, and it's an extremely important question. So thank you.
Então, Jane, thank you very much for your answer. Pessoal, pelo adiantado da hora, a gente precisa acabar essa mesa para passarmos para a segunda mesa, que é de religião e relações internacionais, dentro de alguns minutos. So, Dr. Jane Rooney, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your availability. And for sure, you're going to talk more and more about this subject. Yeah. And Alex, muito obrigado pelo seu discurso, pela sua disponibilidade. E certamente você voltará para falar mais sobre o seu tema, sobre esse assunto tão rico. I would say the same. I would say the same for Jane. Jane, your subject is so rich. It's so complex. For sure, you will return to talk a little more about this.
No, so thank you very much. I'll definitely provide the post-colonial analysis next time.
Perfect. That would be awesome. Alex, valeu. Muito obrigado.
Eu quero agradecer o convite e me colocar à disposição para contribuir em outros momentos sobre essas temáticas.
Claro, certamente. Teu microfone tá fechado.
Desculpa. Vocês estão me ouvindo agora?
Agora.
Muito obrigado, Alex, pela sua contribuição na noite de hoje. Realmente um debate muito rico do ponto de vista da pós-colonialidade, de um jovem acadêmico muito promissor. And Dr. Rooney, I thank you once again for accepting our invitation to speak tonight at this Conference of International Relations. Once again, on behalf of General Director, Sister Miriam Vieira, and on behalf of our General Coordinator of Undergraduate Courses, Dr. Nadia Novena, I would like to extend our sincere thanks for your very instructive presentation on international law, human rights, and transnational corporations. I hope that we can have the opportunity to learn more from you in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Jane. See you soon. Bye-bye.